Hello, welcome to the debate on Sky News. I'm Martin Stanford. Here's our take on developments brought together from America, the UK and around the world. The Paris attacks. Fighting terrorists. Is the world now united? France, Russia and America ramp up their bombing campaign against Islamic State. And the tourist jet out of Egypt was blown up. What can the Middle East countries do now? So far this year, there have been almost 300 terrorist attacks around the world. This month alone, there have been 20 stabbings, shootings and bombings. Wikipedia lists them all here in their list of terrorist incidents, which depressingly goes on and on. The kill list is now some 300 people. Now, in a moment, we'll be speaking to the Egyptian ambassador in London, who's also served in Paris. But as usual, the Democrat commentator Geoffrey Robinson is standing by for us in New York, and the Conservative commentator Armstrong Williams is in Washington. Geoffrey, what a depressing week.
Absolutely. It really is. And it drove this thing home. One of the things that John Kerry said this week in Paris was that he could almost understand that there was some sort of a warped rationale for the attack a year ago on the satirical magazine. But killing innocent civilians like this is just abhorrent, and making it all the more abhorrent, making it all the more insidious, is the fact that most of the ISIS terrorists were homegrown. They come from France and Belgium, and once they're a cancer inside society, it takes a lot of operating to get rid of them. This is a really very dangerous and tragic situation.
Armstrong, Parisians have been saying all week, why us? Why Paris? Do you have a theory as to why Paris?
You know, I was when I was returning from the airport last week after being in London for a week, our private driver, I expressed to him the devastation of what happened in Paris. And without thinking, he just turned to us and said they got what they deserved. They are not very warm to people like us. They're very hostile. And Germany is the same way. And it's just a matter of time before it happens in Germany. And Aideen just kept pulling my arm, making sure that I just did not go off on this guy in the car. I was so angry by what he said. Then I asked him, well, what about 9/11? He said, well, your government was the reason for that. He was so matter of fact of people of his faith and his culture, their hatred of the Parisians and the Germans. And so to answer that question is that what is lurking in Europe that no one is talking about is the perception that as much as Paris, more than anyone else in Europe, tried to do to be supportive of these refugees, to be supportive of the Muslims, to be supportive of people who are not necessarily of their culture, of their faith, the more resentment, because they talk about the poverty, they talk about the isolation, they talk about living in and thriving in ghettos, and they get no attention. And what the press prints and what they say gives them a little momentum to their plight, but it doesn't even scratch the surface. And he felt that this was the only way that they could lash out. And to say this to us, total strangers having no idea what we do for a living, was nothing more than just absolutely shocking.
We'll be back with you two guys in a moment. But first, Egypt was targeted directly by Daesh when it was shot down a holiday jet this month. So what can the Arab states do? Well, let's speak to Nasser Kamel, who's the Egyptian ambassador in London, and before that served in Paris too. Let's talk about the Metrojet, if we may. Is this an embarrassment for Egypt, do you think, that the security at Sharm el-Sheikh was such that this bomb could be planted on this plane?
I don't want to get into early conclusion about the how and exactly what happened. Of course, there is some strong indication that it was a bomb on this plane, but we're waiting always for the final conclusion of the international panel that is investigating this incident quite thoroughly. But you are right when you say Egypt has been targeted by Daesh, be it this horrific incident or others before. I do agree with your guest when you were talking about the cancer and about the need to deal with that cancer. And I don't think we are. And it's not only a fight that the Arabs or the Muslim should carry alone. This is a global fight where we all have to come together to deal with it. And when I say to deal with it, we have to deal with it by security, definitely, but also by anti-messaging, by counter-narrative, by making sure that young Muslims in Europe or everywhere in the world are not subject to this sick propaganda that has nothing to do with the true teaching of Islam.
But what can you do within your country, or what would you advocate your country? And then let's widen it out. What could the Arab world do to try and quieten down, if not silence, the ISIL message, the Daesh message?
Actually, my president was quite straightforward when he dared even Islamic scholars in Egypt and all over the world to deal with the discourse in the religious teaching and the way our religion is being presented, taught, and to young Muslims all over the world. There is a certain discourse. We need to deal with it using institutions like Al-Azhar, which is a moderate Islamic center of learning, to teach the true value of that religion, a religion of peace, a religion that definitely cannot be identified with those who have carried the attacks in Paris the other day.
Well, let's bring in Armstrong and Jeffrey first, standing by in New York. Will that fix it, Jeffrey, just trying to sort out a bit better teaching?
No, I think the problem is, I think that's a good step, but the problem is much more complex. And part of the problem now is the Russians' view about Assad. They are trying to keep him in power in Syria. And I think they take a view that it's either Assad or ISIL. And I think it has to be Assad and ISIL. I don't think Assad, and I'd love to hear what the ambassador says, I don't think Assad is a sideshow. I think he's a main part of this problem.
Ambassador, should President Assad stay in power?
President Assad is definitely part of the problem. There is no argument about that. And a political solution in Syria would eventually lead for a new leadership to emerge in that country. We need to be very clear. I mean, the lingering of this drama in Syria has been actually the reason for ISIL to appear in the first place. I mean, the stateless state where things are in Syria has allowed those fanatics to establish a foothold and then expand and go all the way and control large parts of Iraq. So without a political solution in Syria, one that would reflect the choice of the people, one that would bring to Syria a democratic, secular state that protects the right and freedom of all, we won't be able to deal with the problem.
Okay.
Definitely.
Let me bring in Armstrong, if I may, because Armstrong, that seems like a temptingly simple solution. Sort Syria, and everything else will come good. Is that really it? Is it really that simple?
Well, you know, to make that assumption, you would have to believe that all these dastardly attacks got their momentum and start with Syria. Much of this was happening long before there was ever conflict in Syria. And I think this issue of social media or ISIS have become very deft at recruiting young people who they found that they can pour in this warped philosophy and these ideas and get them to leave places like the United States and other places where they think they can come for a better place, and then they manipulate them even further to recruit their friends to come and join ISIS. You got to find a way to disrupt those algorithms which we have access to, because one of the things that we learned from the French ambassador Kamel is that within minutes they knew who the terrorists were, they knew their profiles, they knew their cell phone numbers. They did not gather that information all of a sudden after those attacks. It tells us they have been tracking those people for a very long time, and they are what we would call suspicious. There's got to be a way that governments and law enforcement must be able to act in a way to take out these terrorists, which they think they have a pretty solid idea in a case that are about to commit these kinds of acts that will kill hundreds of people. I know President Hollande talked about revisiting the Constitution. There's been discussions about revisiting habeas corpus. We certainly don't want to unleash people to go out and assassinate and harm innocent people, but there's got to be a better way that not just tracking these would-be criminals, given their track record, that we've got to be able to do something to disrupt them before they commit these crimes.
Yeah, but Armstrong, hang on. Let's let Jeffrey is nearly exploding here with the idea of you've got a few suspects on a list, you're going to round them all up and incarcerate them?
No. Armstrong is typically moving away from what the discussion really is and going off on some tangent someplace. What the ambassador was saying was that Assad has to be dealt with. And I want to ask the ambassador, because I think the reason Assad has to be dealt with is because the only people who can go after ISIL, the only people who can take this caliphate apart, and it's the size of Indiana, are the Sunnis. And as long as Assad is in Syria, the Sunnis are otherwise preoccupied. Am I right in saying that if we're going to ever have troops on the ground, boots on the ground, they have to be Sunni Muslims to do it, because the Americans are never going in?
Ambassador, would you agree?
I agree that the fight, especially in Syria and Iraq, should be carried by the Syrian and the Iraqi. There is no doubt about it. And let's start with Iraq. I mean, we need to empower the Sunni in Iraq. I'm 100% in agreement that the first answer is to empower the Sunni in Iraq, give them a fair share in their country, make them a real stakeholder in liberating their own areas from ISIL, and the same applies to Syria. Until we have a political solution by which all the Syrian will be united to fight ISIL, we won't be able to uproot this cancer, if I may say so, from Syria and Iraq. I did not mean...
Ambassador, let me just bring it on to the next question then, facing us all. Do we have to be fearful whether we live in Paris or Frankfurt or London? As our Prime Minister has said this week, we are still likely to be attacked. Is that something we have to live with? Is there anything we can do about that?
I don't think anybody is immune, unfortunately, in today's world. As long as the ideology exists, as long as you open the internet and see guidelines for making a bomb, and you see ISIL operating on Twitter, and when you talk to Google and others, they seem to be powerless in dealing with that propaganda. I heard that ISIL is spending $1 billion a year in terms of propaganda on the net, and I'm talking about the net and not the dark net. Until we do lots of things, anti-messaging, solving Syria, none of us, unfortunately, is safe.
Armstrong, that could be done. I mean, you're a bit of a media mogul. What would you do to the media companies to say to them, we need to enforce the messages, or we need to take out the messages that are getting to young people of this destructive nature?
You know, I'm glad the Ambassador Kamel understands the importance of social media, despite Jeffrey continuing often to be at the lunch on the issues that matter most. You know, we have an obligation to shut them down. We have an obligation to monitor them. We have an obligation, if we have to censor them. We have in monitoring them, and the activity follows a thread. A lot of these things, the Ambassador is absolutely correct, happens on these algorithms. They happen in this space where we seem to allow them to do a better job of spreading their propaganda, and we do very little to challenge it. We don't give enough credibility that these young people find most of this, their contact, their connection, their identification with these groups that are very destructive with the internet. And until we Google and all these Yahoos and everybody else get on board, and all these different countries and government gets on board to do a better job of monitoring and following the thread, not much is going to change. That is something they've used to their advantage, and it's simple for us by taking a few simple measures to disrupt it and turn it to our advantage.
State censorship, Jeffrey, that's the answer.
No. The problem is multifaceted. The internet is only one part of it. But you see, the neocons, the Republicans, Armstrong and his mates, and of course the king of them all, Ben Carson, is saying, let's bomb them. Let's bomb them. We'll just bomb them, bomb the hell out of them, and that'll do it. We'll put troops on the ground, and that'll do it. And it will be, and when we do it, it will be replaced by what? That's the problem, is we can bomb them. And then what? Then we create a void. This is what the neocons, Armstrong and Ben Carson and all of these guys did with Iraq. Originally, we invaded Iraq, toppled Hussein, and now what we've got, because we created a void. The problem is not just the internet. Sure, do what you can on the internet, but you've got to have a sound policy. And what you find now with the Republicans is that a guy like Jeb Bush is starting to understand that you can't just bomb them into non-existence, that you've got to provide something for afterwards, that you've got to take care of Assad in Syria. And Jeb Bush is starting to sound almost like Hillary Clinton, the next president of the United States, who will just do just that.
Well, let me in conclusion put that point to the ambassador, can I? Is there a military solution? Can you bomb them to submission, ambassador?
Multifaceted approach, 100%. I agree with him 100%. We need to use force if we have to at a certain point, at certain cases. We need to take care of the messaging. When we have 70,000 fatwa on the internet coming from ISIL every month, that needs to be dealt with. We need to talk. We need to get our scholar to teach the true value of this religion to young Muslim in Islamic country and also in Europe and in the United States. Multifaceted approach. We need to find a solution, a diplomatic one in Syria. We need to empower the Sunni in Iraq to be able to face ISIL there. There is no simple answer, unfortunately. It has to be a very complex, and first of all, we need to be united, and we need to come together and look into the problem as an international community and not leave France alone or Egypt alone or the Syrians alone.
Ambassador Nasser Kamel, thank you very much. Now, a reminder, you can catch up with the Sky News debate on Apple TV, on Roku, and catch up, and of course, at skynews.com/US. Next, are the world's military and intelligence communities now working in harmony against Daesh, the Islamic State group? Well, let's bring in Fred Fleitz, a former CIA analyst and staff member with the House Intelligence Committee, now a senior vice president at the Center for Security Policy. I bet they're not all working together, Fred Fleitz, are they? I mean, the Russians and Americans don't cooperate over anything.
That seems to be the case. It looks like the French and the Russians are starting to collaborate, but the United States is refusing to share intelligence with Russia because it wants this diplomatic process to bring about a new government in Syria and the removal of Assad to move forward. Frankly, this is just a fig leaf. I think this is a fig leaf by the Obama administration to do as little as possible about this situation, and French President Hollande is going to be talking to President Obama to get him to change that position.
But you've got to fix something in Syria. You can't do another Iraq, can you, of destroy one part of a country or one faction of a country or one leadership in a country and leave a vacuum behind afterwards?
I think the Assad problem is a problem for another day. We need a ground force in Iraq and Syria led by NATO with Arab troops to take out ISIS positions. ISIS is not going to be defeated from the air, and we can't use these arguments about fighting the Iraq war. The Iraq war is another war. We're now faced with a war against a terrorist army, and if we don't take it out, the threat is just going to grow.
But the lesson from the Iraq war, wouldn't you agree, was the post-conflict planning. We can argue till the cows come home about whether it was right to start the war, but after the war, there was no country left. The infrastructure was destroyed. No wonder people got desperate. You cannot do the same thing again in Syria, could you?
I don't think the two situations are analogous. There was a sectarian conflict going on in Iraq. The situation in Syria after we take ISIS out is probably going to be to the benefit of the Assad regime. I think that's probably an outcome that is inevitable because of Russian support for Assad. It's not a great outcome, but we can't let this current situation of this terrorist army to continue. We have to take ISIS out.
Jeffrey Robinson is standing by in New York. Armstrong Williams, as ever, is in Washington for us. Armstrong, get an army together and go and sort these guys out. Is that the solution?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with our guest, and I think what he's not saying is that, you know what, special ops work. There are special forces that are more trained, more better at this. They understand any idiosyncrasies of these areas. They have contacts. They work very well with different arms of intelligences of countries. They know more about these people than you can imagine. And sometimes what happens is that laws of different countries tie their hands and prohibit them from doing their jobs. At some point, we're going to have to take a look at some of these laws that prohibit some of these agents and these special ops from doing their job, because this crisis is growing. The world is at threat, our stability, and we just got to give them the freedom to do what they do best. And to put it in blunt terms, what we have to do, we just have to turn our head and close our eyes, because maybe we may not like the way they do their business, but as long as they get the job done and take these terrorist threats out, disrupt their financial networks, disrupt the threads that they have in terms of how they communicate, eavesdropping on them by any means necessary to destroy them on every level until they're no longer a threat.
So if your prediction, Jeffrey, is right and it's President Clinton in a year's time, would that be a strategy she would adopt?
Of course, no. She would not adopt that strategy. We won't send troops in, because ISIS wants nothing more than to be able to go public with, look at that, the West versus Islam. I mean, it's just laid out there for them if we do this. You know, this whole idea, you see it in the campaign now. Donald and all the others are saying, bomb them, just bomb them back to the Stone Age. And Fred, who comes from a group run by Frank Gaffney, who part of these neocon wackos who brought us the Iraq War. Remember weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist? No, the fact is we can't bomb them because we'll leave a void. We did it in Iraq. We're not going to repeat that. We need to take Assad out at the same time when we put Sunni troops on the ground, Islamic troops on the ground. It's the only way that ISIL will be defeated. American troops, French troops, Russian troops just aren't going to do it.
Fred Fleitz, you wanted to come in there.
It would be suicide.
I think that's just a fantasy. There's not going to be a Sunni force going into Syria. It would be nice. I'd like to see that. But there's not going to be a substantial force in Syria and Iraq unless it's led by NATO. I think we have to be realistic. And the more we put this off, the more this terrorist threat is going to grow.
More neocon wacko conspiracy theories. Utter nonsense, utter claptrap. We stand on your record, the Iraq War.
You know what? I'm glad we have the experts and someone like the CIA who's worked on these issues who can give us informative information and not emotionalism.
The CIA. Give me a break.
What's that?
Senior clerk who works for Frank Gaffney, an Islamophobe, hatred-mongering, conspiracy-mongering, a bunch of wackos. Come on. They have no credibility whatsoever.
I won't tell you who sounds like the wacko right now.
Yeah. No credibility whatsoever. No one pays attention to these wackos. We did, and that's what got us into Iraq in the first place.
Okay, well, hang on. Let me just step in here and ask a question of Fred, seeing as we've got him as our guest this afternoon. Right. How are you going to put the coalition together, Fred? Because the Iraq War, as we know only too well here in the UK, was a very controversial political decision, putting that coalition together, the UK, the US, etc. How are you going to put a coalition together to deal with IS on the ground right now?
Well, I first want to defend Frank Gaffney and the Center for Security Policy. We have done important work on the threat from the global jihad movement, and I encourage your viewers to go to our website, securefreedom.org, to see the important work that we've been doing on this. I mean, there is certainly intervention fatigue in the United States and the UK. No one in either country wants to send troops to another Mideast conflict.
Right, so
and
it's
I
not
think
going to happen.
We have to avoid that if we can. But frankly, the ISIS threat has shown that France is at war with a terrorist army, and I'm afraid that terrorist army is going to strike again, and we have to start thinking about realistic ways to take it out. They're not going to be defeated by the air, and this idea of a total Sunni army is just a fantasy.
Jeffrey, let's step aside from the emotion of the specifics of the strategy and ask you to have a look at the election scene as the presidential election campaign for both sides rolls on. Is this not going to impact on almost all the candidates? Because there is a sort of, on one hand, a demand for action, a demand to be safe. On the other hand, as Fred was saying, there's a fatigue. No candidate, let me put you the suggestion, can afford to recommend spending more money in any country right now with another military adventure. They just get laughed out of town, wouldn't they?
No, because that's exactly what Ted Cruz is talking about. It's exactly what Ben Carson is talking about. Send in special ops. No, this is all nonsense. There are real winners and real losers politically in this debate. One of the winners is Donald Trump, and he has surged way ahead of Ben Carson. I mean, in the latest polls, He's beaten Carson 38-19, 27-20, and 33-17. These are the polls of this week, where Carson is disintegrating. I mean, watch his interview on Fox News with Chris Wallace, and you'll see the real Ben Carson completely turned to rubble. The other man who is emerging as the adult in the room is Jeb Bush. Now, I think he may be too far behind to catch up, but Jeb Bush, this is his opportunity. If he doesn't take it now, I'm afraid that Donald will buy his way into the primaries. The fact is that the Republicans are very worried about Donald, and there are rumors now, and I believe them, that they've gone to Mitt Romney and said, "We're going to bring you back from the dead." I don't know if Romney would do it.
Well, okay, that's a little side street we can go down some other time. But let me just keep it on the fight against Islamic State, and let me put a final thought to Fred, if I may. Fred Fleitz, the difficulty your country faces is that I suppose it's one step removed. It's the Atlantic Ocean removed from the events of this last week. And I don't mean to sound cheapen the suffering of the French in any sense, but do you fear that it will take another terrible event on American soil really to galvanize American politicians to take real action?
I'm fearful that's going to be the case both in Europe or the United States. I think that this group that was just taken out in Saint-Denis was planning additional terrorist attacks in Europe, maybe in the UK, maybe in France, maybe in Germany. I think it's very possible there could be an attack like this in the United States. There's 900 open ISIS-related investigations going on right now, according to the Department of Homeland Security. I think it could change our outlook. Let's just pray this doesn't happen.
Fred Fleitz, thanks for being with us today. And that's it for this edition of The Debate. You can continue watching Sky News on Apple TV, on Roku, and catch up, and of course at skynews.com. Until next time, goodbye.